right, welcome back. And today, shifting gears, but still in the same car. The overview of the politics. So we've looked in several hundred previous videos, I think it was, where we looked at the Nicomachean Ethics. Went through that in its more or less in its entirety. Gave you an overview, a relatively in-depth overview, I hope, of that. This video is just a quick overview of where the Nicomachean Ethics leads, and that's, yay, the politics. And the politics, all right, let's see if I can spell it correctly. So the politics here is the extension, right? It's like the part 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. We looked at eudaimonia, we talked about what it is, how does it work, and Aristotle eventually says, look, we're not just after a theoretical understanding, although we want that, that's important, that's necessary, we need it, we want it, we need it, we have an idea of it. Go back to those previous videos and have a look at that. Aristotle says it's not sufficient to have this theoretical understanding. We have to look at how do we produce individuals, how do we produce citizens, real citizens, concrete citizens that exist, that can experience eudaimonia. How do we do that? We got to talk about politics now. We got to talk about a state structure. We got to figure out how we can build together a community that enables us to live as citizens, to be citizens, participating in a common life, and ultimately having these experiences of eudaimonia. How are we going to do that? Because we're not gods. We're sort of like gods. We can try and imitate them, but we're not gods. We can't achieve eudaimonia on our own. We're not like animals either, so we have this touch of the divine. So we are indeed composite type creatures. We're a little odd, so we band together. We are, the zoon politikon. We are political animals, social animals. That's what we are, with a touch of the divine sprinkled in. So the politics is, now, just about, rather than the position, the politics is as a work. Yeah, we talk about it as a single tract or a single discussion, but it's actually more of a collection of writings or essays. You can think of it like that, than an extended singular discussion. I'll come back to this in a second. So there's often, a lot of problems with the organization of it, et cetera, that we really didn't have as much of. We had a little taste of that in the Nicomachean Ethics when we saw sometimes Aristotle would return to a topic. We would think he's returning, and he wouldn't even say, I'm going to go back to the notion of hedone, as he did later on. It's like he's just starting it all over again, and maybe there were some editing errors or things like that have come down to us through the centuries. So this story of the manuscript of the politics is it's a bit of a confused one, and but I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'll just make a few general comments in this video about the politics, and we'll dive into some more doctrinal material in a later video. All right, so what's going on here? Well, unlike the Nicomachean Ethics, which has 10, politics has 8 books in all. And what roughly are these books about? Well, I'm going to concentrate on some books more than others. I'm going to concentrate a lot on sort of the foundational aspects, the presuppositions that are linked up with the Nicomachean Ethics and the roles that these presuppositions play in Aristotle's conception of politics. Well, the first thing that we want to look at is book 1. The notion of the city-state, so 2 things, the notion of the city-state and the concept of the household. These are critical. Remember, we talked a lot about the household and the role that it plays in the teaching of ethics, because you got to be taught by your parents, you got to be raised right in order to learn ethics, and in order to get to the point where you can experience eudaimonia, your parents, the household, has to have done its job. So what is the household? Well, we haven't seen that in the Nicomachean Ethics. It was just mentioned that you should come from a good one. Well, what's a good one? How's it structured? Aristotle is going to give us his spin on it, and it's not without controversy, because it is, as many would say, a very traditional, sexist, arguably racist view of what a household would look like. So anyway, so we'll dive into that in a video. But for now, so Aristotle will say what they are, and he's not saying what they should be. He's saying what they in fact are, And you probably could infer that he's thinking that this is the right way. But in any case, we'll look at that in a little more detail. But just for now, he's saying, in book 1, he's saying what they are and that they're natural. So he might say something like, well, you may not like it, but this is the natural way things are, and maybe you don't like the way natural things are. Might be an Aristotelian response if you say, well, I don't like the way the family is structured. He thinks it's natural. So, and what's going to be in here is the relationships between parents and children, the relationships between and sort of these hierarchies of parents and children, men and women, and of course slavery. So that's all in book 1. So there's a lot of controversial stuff, but it's important to understand Aristotle's thinking on it and how a lot of this does in fact relate to things he has said in the Nicomachean Ethics, like when he talked about eudaimonia not being possible for slaves. Why does he think that? All right, and what does he mean by natural? So we'll have a look at that. Then in the second book, it's a critique of some existing, like very concrete, again, very concrete, a critique of supposedly best constitutions. So Aristotle will look at some actual constitutions. Later, he will offer us a theory of constitutions. Book 4, he will look at poor or inferior constitutions, so some good ones, some bad ones, a theory of constitutions. He will look in book 5 at the preservation or destruction of these things we call constitutions. Book 6 is a discussion of the notions of democracy and oligarchy. And of course, Plato, Aristotle's great mentor, was not a fan of democracy. He didn't like it, didn't think it was a good idea, given all the experiences that the Athenians had. And so we'll look at what Aristotle has to say about democracy and then, of course, oligarchy as well. And then in the later books, we have an outline of the best constitution. So we get an idea of what Aristotle thinks is the best, but alas, it's incomplete. We don't think that what we have is maybe not his complete thoughts, or maybe we have his best and he just didn't finish it. So it's always hard to say exactly what the most accurate way to interpret this. But we're pretty confident that this is an incomplete work. So a couple of problems I'll mention with the work, the politics, and so number 1 is like the order of the books. What's the best order? What did Aristotle intend? How did he write them? We're not really sure. And that's not the order of things is not a terribly unique question. In most works of these ancient writers, we're not really sure what order they wrote them in. But the Nicomachean Ethics seems pretty clear, but nonetheless, as we've seen, there's some odd sorts of twists and turns in the text there. But this one seems to be a little bit worse. So the order of the books is a scholarly problem, trying to figure out, because how you read books, how you read them, what that is, the order, will influence how you interpret them. So it's not just an idle pastime to figure out what the order was. It makes a big difference. If you read them in a certain way, you'll get an overall view of the politics. You read them in a different way, you get a different view. So again, it's not just a simple, and trite academic exercise. And the last problem number 2, is the whole notion, is this really consistent? And we've seen in the Nicomachean Ethics, is it entirely consistent? Debatable, right? Aristotle really starts off with a kind of very concrete human notion of eudaimonia, and as we saw at the end, he displaces that to a secondary position in favor of this highly sort of divine-like notion, this imitation of God type notion of eudaimonia. So is that an inconsistency? And we'll look here. Are there inconsistencies in these books? Well, maybe they are, but we shouldn't take them that seriously because maybe it's just a collection of writings. And Aristotle, if he were around today, might say, well, those were ideas I developed at different points in my life, and I never thought of them as having to be consistent. Maybe he would point to one particular book or section and say, that's my most mature position, if you like. So, anyways, there's a number of problems. It's more of a scattered text than the Nicomachean Ethics, but it's extremely important because it does give us an idea of where you go after the sort of the individual ethics. So this we could say if you like. This is Aristotle's notion of public ethics. Private ethics was the Nicomachean ethics, more or less. That's not completely accurate, but this is definitely the public ethics aspect of Aristotle when he's talking about how we can construct a community in which we can achieve eudaimonia. So there's your overview. Stay tuned, and we're going to look at, in the next video, what's going on here with respect to the household and the city-state. See you next video.